Hello, everybody. My name is Rene Valenzuela, and my presentation is on Brazilian exports from 2018 to 2020. So exports and imports are vital components of international trade. Both determine a country's balance of trade. Now, balance of trade indicates if a country is running a trade surplus, meaning it exports more than it imports, or a trade deficit, meaning it imports more than it exports. Now, balance of trade is one of several factors involved in determining a country's GDP. By tracking exportation data, countries can monitor their trade balance, comply with trade regulations, devise economic plans and policies, and much more. And here is my data model. This was a bit of a struggle to come up with this because I had to, initially I wanted to import the data set through SSIS and then, through Power Query, then that didn't work and I had to go through a whole host of different attempts. But ultimately I managed to do it through SQL Server and then imported it to Power BI. And yeah, one fact table, 4 dimension tables, and measures table. And here I have 5 KPIs: total export earnings per month, export concentration, export earnings month over month, and export earnings year over year, which I will shortly go through when I show my report. As I said, my report tracks export earnings along with other related KPIs across several dimensions, such as product, location of production, export destination and date, as well as fields such as sector, industry group, and industry. Now, here in the dashboard, we have a year slicer, which lets you choose the year or years that you want to look into. So, and below that, we have our 5 KPIs. Now, total export earnings is the simplest one. It sums export earnings according to the filters applied in a given moment. Below that, export earnings per month divides total export earnings by the number of months present in the current filter context to give the earnings per month for a given time period. And then we have export concentration, which shows what percentage of export earnings an entity or attribute accounts for. So for example, if I click on, let's say, Mato Grosso, this state, export concentration, it essentially lets you know in terms of the Brazil, the total export earnings accounted for by this single state. And this measure also, or this KPI also. And then below that, we have export earnings month over month, which shows how earnings fluctuate from month to month in a given time period. And finally, export earnings year over year shows how earnings vary from the current year to the previous year, or if several years are selected, it gives the average for those years. And I also have a SubKPI called state export concentration. Now you can't see it yet because I set it up so that it only appears when you've selected a state. So let me go ahead and do that. Here we go. And what this SubKPI does is that it shows the percentage of export earnings an entity accounts for in a selected state. So for example, let me select a sector and you'll see that the value will change. So essentially what this tells you is that it tells you that the material sector accounts for 17.7% of the of Sao Paulo, or of this state's total export earnings. Now let's quickly go through the maps and charts. Now the shape map shows Brazil states, which are shaded according to total export earnings, as you can see. Next to that, we have a field map, which shows the regions and countries that Brazil exports to. Again, here, darker shades represent higher export earnings as well. And with this map, we can drill down to see individual countries, not just continents. And above that, we have a line and clustered column chart which is 4-tiered, and it can drill down from sector, which is the highest level of hierarchy I set up on it, to all the way down to product. And next to that, we have another line and cluster column chart, which shows individual years and can drill down on each of those years to show months. So, for example, let me click on 2018 here, and you can see that it shows the individual months. Now, both of these charts visualize 4 of the KPIs, and by doing that, they allow you to view them across product and time dimensions, respectively. Now, I want to take a look at the state of Para, which is up here, and we can see that it accounted for 7.9% of Brazil's export earnings from 2018 to 2020. Now, if we select materials, we can see that the materials sector accounts for 90.9% of Para's export earnings. And it accounts for 7.2% of Brazil's export earnings, so at a national level. Now, what this means is that one sector in one state brings in almost 1/10 of the country's export earnings. Now, export earnings for the materials sector in Para have risen by 15.67% every year for 3 years. Now, when we compare that to the materials sector throughout the entire country, so let me click on that really quickly. We can see that it's decreased by 2.3% at a national level. And we get an idea of how bad it could be overall for the economy if export earnings from the material sector in Para were also declining, given, as I mentioned earlier, how much of the national export earnings it accounts for at a national level. Now, thankfully, this wasn't the case. Now, for a negative insight, I want to look at, here are the filters. I want to look at the state of Sao Paulo. And right off the bat, we can see here that it accounts for 24.2% of the country's total export earnings, which is a quarter, a very high amount. And we can see that if we look over here at this chart, we can see that many different sectors generate earnings for Sao Paulo. Now, this is good because a more diverse distribution of export earnings across sectors can lessen the impact of economic downturns. Now, let me click really on the industrial sector here, and we'll see that it accounted for, there we go, for 22.6% of Sao Paulo's export earnings, and it accounted for 5.5% of Brazil's export earnings. Now, the export earnings year-over-year KPI tells us that export earnings for the industrial sector in Sao Paulo have been declining by 19.5% each year for the last 2 years. Now, Sao Paulo's export earnings have been decreasing. Sao Paulo's export earnings have been decreasing by 14.37% each year for the last 2 years, or 12.74% if you were to exclude the industrial sector from the average. Now, the industrial's earnings decreasing this much while being a notable contributor to the state's export earnings is a very worrying situation. Now, let's look at the last year only, the last to 2020, and we can tell that the industrial sector's export earnings have plummeted from Okay, we can see that the industrial sector's export earnings have plummeted from 2019 to 2020. And if you look here at the KPIs in this chart, you can see that it's the industry that's been hit the hardest. Now, I want to look at the world map below, and here we can see, if I drill down quickly, we can see that the US is the biggest customer of Sao Paulo's industrial sector, as reflected by the shades, the darker shades. And now, given that the year selected, the data right now is reflecting the year 2020, it has to do with Brazil and the US. It's easy to surmise that because Brazil and the US Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, where did I cut out?
Brazil and the US.
Okay. All right, given that Brazil and the US are the two countries that were most affected by COVID in terms of deaths, and that global supply chain disruptions occurred during that time period, their heaviest, it makes sense that exports from Brazil to the US decreased, especially by such a large percentage. Now, you might be thinking, yeah, I already know that COVID disrupted the economy. That's obvious. And I agree. It's no big revelation, but it's still important to understand the extent to which the economy was affected, which sectors and industries were most affected, and which trading partners imported less. Now, I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint presentation. Now, for my recommendations, I have 3, and the first one is that the data shows that the US is the biggest customer of the industrial sector in Sao Paulo and in Brazil overall. 35.9% of Sao Paulo's industrial sector products go to the US. Now, given how the US market for Sao Paulo's industrial sector trended, one possible solution might be to diversify target markets to decrease export concentration and dependence on the US market for industrial products or exports. Now, this diversification concept can be applied to any other state, sector, or market, so it's not just limited to this one occurrence. And the next suggestion I have is, since as shown in the data, prior to 2020, the industrial sector earnings had decreased from 2018 to 2019. Now, COVID merely amplified that decrease. An analysis could be run to identify competitor countries and any comparative advantages that they might have. Now, factors that may allow the industrial sector to recapture its share of the market and practices such as competitive pricing, improvements in product quality, volume discounts, and special promotions must be identified and applied when they can lead to improvements. And for my last insight, as can be seen in the data, over the 3-year period from 2018 to 2020, Brazil has had a decrease of 4.4% in export earnings every year. Now, this applies to all states, sectors, industries, and more. The current downturn might be largely influenced by global economic conditions or by more particular issues. The industrial sector's downturn has had the largest effect on the country due to its high decrease in export earnings and its share of export concentration. So analysis of the current global economic conditions to determine trading partners and rivals economic conditions would be beneficial. And governmental action can be taken by entering into trade partnerships and agreements, providing export support and incentives, and improving trade infrastructure, and several more options as well. And that concludes my presentation. I hope it was enjoyable.